right, welcome back. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking about public opinion and how important it is for the public to, for the public will to be reflected in the actions of government. This week, we're going to start learning about the media and the role of political information. A free and independent media are essential features of any democratic government. The more democracy is, the more that the media is basically controlled by government, or for that matter, by any powerful interest, the less accurate the information will be that will come to the public. We've had a lot of news in the last couple of days that really kind of reflects on the role that the media plays in American politics. Yesterday, a CBS program, 60 Minutes, ran an unscripted interview with Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee. This is now less than a month out from the November elections. There was a lot of complaining within the media that Kamala Harris was, basically not exposing herself sufficiently to the media. A lot of people within the Democratic Party were concerned that the campaign was too tightly controlling access to Harris. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think, and we'll learn more about this when we get to the campaign process. But it's important to keep in mind that Kamala Harris was not in your typical position as a presidential candidate. She inherited the Democratic nomination. She very quickly secured it after the guy the incumbent had all but secured the nomination, and then decided that it probably was in the best interests of the Democratic Party for him to withdraw. So she was on a much shorter timeline than your typical presidential candidate. And so when time is compressed, the margin for error gets a lot tighter. You have a lot smaller margin of error to successfully run a campaign. Kamala Harris had been a senator from California. She had been vice president, but she still was not that well known. There remain lots and lots of questions about her. And so doing a blitz of kind of unscripted media at this time, in the Harris campaign's view, is probably the best time to do it. She's had an opportunity to get her feet firmly on the ground. She's had the opportunity to study the issues. You've gone through presidential and vice presidential debates, and so now is the time to basically put yourself in front of the media and expose yourself to questions. Ironically, of course, Donald Trump was also invited to go on Meet the Press, but refused, and he has largely been doing again what we would call friendly media events with X and with other conservative media outlets, Fox News and the like, where again he's not being subject that much to careful questioning. Another important thing that is happening right now is the hurricane season is becoming an increasingly newsworthy event, and of course, in the midst of a very closely contested campaign, the coverage of Hurricane Helene, which just devastated Florida, Georgia, and parts of North Carolina, and is now being followed up by Hurricane Milton, which is now a Category 4 and may even be a Category 5 hurricane by the time it reaches the coast of Florida. And again, what role do those kinds of natural disasters play in a presidential campaign? You would historically say that they should be bipartisan events. No one should be trying to make hay out of other people's discomfiture. Nevertheless, Donald Trump has been arguing that Hurricane Helene is the Harris campaign's Hurricane Katrina, which references a hurricane that devastated New Orleans during the Bush administration, and the Bush administration's very flawed response to Hurricane Katrina in 2006 really, really damaged the Bush administration's credibility. Now, part of the problem with the hurricane coverage is first and foremost that the hurricane devastated some really hard to get to areas of North Carolina. There are some mountainous areas in North Carolina that were subject to exceptional flooding, and of course, mountainous areas are hard to get into. If you wash out all, most of the roads coming in and they're underwater, it's very hard to get help into those relatively isolated communities. And so, the federal government has had to resort to helicopters to get to those places. And the Trump administration the Trump campaign is trying to make the argument that they have reacted slowly and that they have bungled the response. Now, again, we're less than a week into this disaster. I think it's probably more a reflection of the critics than anything else in terms of looking at that response. It presents novel difficulties in terms of how the federal government, again, keep in mind, state governments are first responders to most disasters, and then they declare a disaster area, and that unleashes the federal government to go into those areas. This is a reflection of our federal system of government. And the state and the federal and local governments should all be working in tandem, pulling together to try and help those people who have been, who are in these communities that are impacted by these horrific events. So what are we going to learn today? First of all, we're going to talk about the importance of the media to democracy. They play several very essential roles in the political process, but they are also roles that pull the media into contested territory. Second, we're going to look at the different sources of political news. Of course, for many years, television was the dominant place where people got news from. Increasingly, Americans are getting their news from social media, and that has serious consequences. So the media are indispensable to American democracy. Like I mentioned a minute ago, without a free and independent press, which is a euphemism that we use for the media, without independent sources of information, government can basically control what people think, and we really want to avoid that as much as possible. And yet, at the same time, the media's independence is increasingly coming under question because fewer and fewer major corporations control a larger and larger proportion of the news organizations that Americans rely on. So why did the framers believe in freedom of the press? Many of the framers were harshly critical of the newspapers of their day because the newspapers of their day were often partisan and oftentimes highly critical of the founding generation. In particular, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson all made comments that are now quotes in posterity for just how bad the media could be. At the same time, Thomas Jefferson said, the media is indispensable. So the framers also had a great deal of experience of censorship under the British. The British government did not countenance a free media. In fact, the first newspaper of the day, Public Occurrences, which was published in Boston, was immediately shut down because it had been printed without the approval of government. And under the British idea of colonial governance, it was the responsibility of a printer to actually get permission from government prior to publishing any kind of broadsheets that would be distributed to the public. That reflected to some extent the tensions of the time, but also it reflected the British sensibility of the relationship between the public and government. To them, people getting riled up was potentially sedition. which was a word that doesn't really fit well within American political culture, because we emerged as a culture of sedition. So, following the Revolutionary War, that founding generation was determined to maintain a free and independent press. And again, it's important to keep in mind when you say the press, it is a metaphor for the actual physical act of a printing press, which was the dominant way that news was gathered and disseminated. Was, you had people get stories, and they would come back and write them up, and then they would use a printing press to print as many copies of that as they needed. And some people would argue that First Amendment prohibition, and insistence on freedom of the press really did refer physically to printing presses. That basically it was a bar on the government exerting a monopoly over printing. So that freedom of the press clause, and it's important to keep in mind during the Revolutionary War, the Continental armies, when they occupied a British sympathizing town, were not shy about shutting down newspapers that were pro-British. And in fact, that was oftentimes one of the first things that they did, which led one historian to say that freedom of the press meant freedom of the press for people who spoke the speech of liberty, and not just absolute freedom of the press. So what is it that the public, that the media does to facilitate democracy? The first thing, and probably the most important, but not by a lot, is this idea of informing the public. In order for citizens to be able to identify their self-interest and to pursue their life goals, they have to have accurate information as it relates to politics. The second is that it provides a forum for candidates, politicians, and the public to debate policies and issues. And that's a very important role that oftentimes draws the media into controversy. When I mentioned a minute ago that Donald Trump had refused to appear on Meet the Press, one of the Trump campaign's rationales for refusing to appear, first and foremost, was he had appeared on Meet the Press and was going to there was going to be an interview with Lesley Stahl, one of the 60 Minutes correspondents, and she pushed him on some issues, and he simply got up and walked out. He was highly insulting to the journalist, and one of the rationales that the Trump campaign made for refusing to appear on Meet the Press was that they were, one of the conditions was that they were going to fact check him in real time. And Donald Trump does not like to be fact checked. He complained about that during one of the debates, where again, I think it was the ABC debate, where they checked him in real time numerous times. And he complained about it and said, they checked me constantly and they hardly ever checked Kamala Harris. Well, the reality is when you look at the fact checks, that the major media have done, unfortunately, Donald Trump said a lot more misleading things. He persists in saying things that, after they have been debunked. And he has been one of the major drivers of misinformation about Hurricane Helene relief. He's made the argument that FEMA is out of money because the Biden administration had diverted a bunch of money to helping immigrants. Well, that's actually not the case. FEMA has adequate resources to manage Hurricane Helene. However, given the scope of the damage of Hurricane Helene, there are probably going to have to be additional appropriations. That is sort of the normal functions of the federal government. You have what you think, a projected idea of what FEMA's budget will need to be to manage a hurricane season, and then you have the reality. And so the third thing is also that the media is supposed to act as a watchdog on the actions of politicians and government. They are supposed to expose corruption. They're exposed to, they're supposed to expose, misdeeds of government. Now, those last two in particular, but really all three, potentially pull the media into the political debates. And oftentimes there's a guy, a media journalist by the name of Eric Alterman, that wrote a book, and in the book it was called What Liberal Media. He basically makes the argument that politicians work the refs. That's sort of a sports metaphor, for coaches that will argue on behalf of their team, and sometimes they can jawbone the officials into calling the game more in their side's favor, and that is a common that is a common thing, and of course, the media also is highly sensitized to being manipulated, and so they're oftentimes highly resistant, and that's one of the reasons for the fact checks of Donald Trump, because everybody believes that he was, that he benefited from the way the media approached coverage in 2016. And there was sort of a correction in 2020. What's really unprecedented is that Donald Trump has been the Republican nominee for the third consecutive election, despite having lost in 2020. Ordinarily, really, I believe it's only been Democrats that have consistently run, two candidates. Grover Cleveland won in '84, lost in '88, won in 1892. Likewise, Republicans did run Thomas Dewey in 1944 against FDR, and then ran him again in 1948. But these are exceptions, not the rule. Ordinarily, when you lose, support for you kind of evaporates, and that has not happened to Donald Trump. So journalists are trained to seek the truth by fact-checking information and sources. And this is this is an important aspect of effective journalism. You get stories. I was reading a story today about Michael Steele, who was a former British intelligence agent who set up shop as an investigative journalist who was hired by a consulting group to research allegations of Russian ties to Donald Trump in the 2016 campaigns. And he produced a series of memos that became known as the Steele dossier. And the problem for Steele, and ultimately for people who relied a lot on those stories, is that intelligence is oftentimes not subject to corroboration. You hear rumors, you report the rumors, and then you estimate based on the credibility of the source. Steele really didn't do that. He's now actually come up with a book that he has published entitled Unredacted, that again is probably going to create a stir because it's October and we're a month out from a presidential election. And there's undoubtedly going to be allegations in that book that likely will not look good for Donald Trump. Journalists have an obligation to make sure, as much as they can, that what they are reporting is truthful. And so in the media, in the journalism business, one of the principles is you want to get it first. You want to get the scoop, but then the saying is get it first, but first get it second. In other words, confirm your sources. Get a second source that can corroborate the story that you're contemplating running. Another important aspect of journalistic principles is the idea of objectivity, where again you don't want to be the part of the story. You don't want to be perceived as being a partisan. And that is one of the things that journalists try to avoid doing. The whole idea of objectivity is that they want to be viewed as impartial in their reporting. And they want to also be viewed as independent, right? It's a really harsh criticism of journalists to say that they are carrying water for a politician or for a political party, okay? So principled journalism emphasizes accuracy, transparency, which means, again, here's where I'm getting my sources from, here is what they told me. And then the idea of impartiality, the idea that, as a journalist, I don't have a motivation for writing this story other than I believe that it's newsworthy and I believe that it is important for the public to know. Another aspect of journalism is this idea of adversarial journalism. Adversarial journalism logically flows from investigative journalism, which is, again, the media kind of fulfilling its watchdog role, that third important function of the media. And so one of the problems with watchdog journalism is that it can often morph into attack dog journalism. So again, investigative journalism emerged out of the late 19th century progressive era muckrakers. The progressive era, again, we've talked about it a little bit. It refers to a good government movement in the late 19th century that kind of lasts from the 1880s into around 1920. Most people think that the end of World War I kind of marks the end of the progressive era. And it reflected, again, this idea of good government. And there was a lot of people, political scientists, journalists, other kinds of academics, religious figures. All of these folks were kind of part of the progressive movement. And they were, again, committed to improving the quality of government in the United States. And they did a lot of very important things. And so from, again, when you think about some of the major events during the progressive era that reflected this idea of investigative journalism. Upton Sinclair, who was a muckraker, a progressive era journalist, published the book The Jungle, I believe it was in 1904, that was an investigation of the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And just, it was an expose of just how unsanitary it was and how harsh the working conditions were. And after publication of The Jungle, it basically compelled the federal government to create the Food and Drug Administration and to also create a meat inspection process. To ensure that the meat that people were getting, and again, back in those days, most meat was salted and preserved and put in tin containers, kind of what we consider to be Spam today. And so, because again, you had this massive movement of people from the countryside into cities where people had less access to fresh meat. And so, again, that reflects this idea that it was a good government movement. But at the same time, the people that were being adversely affected by it, didn't think highly of them. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, coined the phrase muckraker, and it was, kind of a pungent metaphor for, muckrakers were those rakes that you used in stalls to rake out, horse refuse, and that really. Reflected sort of the hostility that many people in government had towards that kind of emerging investigative journalism. The modern variant of adversarial journalism really emerged in the late 1960s in investigating the Vietnam War, and also the 1970s in investigating the Nixon administration. Earlier presidents had really enjoyed very cordial relations with the press. And when you think about it too, journalism really emerges during the Progressive Era. Progressive Era was a good government movement. And in those periods, many of the Democratic presidents, Woodrow Wilson and FDR in particular, were they had good relations with the media because they were doing things that the media generally thought were good government reforms. And so for much of that period in the mid-20th century, early and mid-20th century, journalists had a pretty friendly, kind of cozy relationship with politicians and administrations. The Vietnam War, which again lasts from 1950, U.S. involvement in Vietnam lasts from 1954 to 1975, and it shattered what foreign policy scholars call the Cold War consensus, and led to a split between Republicans and Democrats over how to deal with the Cold War. And it also led to much more aggressive investigative journalism. Now, what kind of contributes to investigative journalism becoming more of an attack dog kind of activity? The Nixon administration, and again, Richard Nixon despised the media. He believed that the media was to blame for his defeat in the 1960 presidential election and his subsequent defeat in 1962 in the California gubernatorial election. And so he really became paranoid about the media and was convinced that they were hostile to him. And so he had an enemies list, and he used the federal government, the power of the federal government, to attack both rival politicians within the Democratic Party, but also journalists that he believed were hostile to him. And of course, really what drove Nixon from office were revelations that in 1972 and 73, he had used private surrogates to invade a doctor's office, a psychologist's office, trying to get dirt on one of the major leakers of the Pentagon Papers. And then a year later, he ordered people to break into the Watergate Hotel to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And it was the coverage of that crime, because the Watergate break-in was actually interdicted by police, and those guys were arrested. And that's what led two Washington Post, two very junior Washington Post journalists to investigate investigations of the Nixon administration that eventually led to all the stuff that we now call Watergate. And it didn't just include that break-in. It also included the reality that the Nixon administration had a slush fund that they kept outside of the federal campaign contribution limits, and that there were other, that he had used the IRS to compel audits of rival politicians and other people that he viewed as enemies. It was these abuses of power that led Nixon to resign from the presidency in 1973, again, largely in the face of the fact that he was going to be impeached over Watergate by the House of Representatives, and that he did not have sufficient support in the Senate to actually survive a Senate impeachment trial. We'll learn more about this in a couple of weeks when we get to the presidency, but for now it's important to keep in mind impeachment, is the House a majority, it only takes a majority, 218 members of the House to impeach, but then you have to get 2/3 of the Senate to actually remove an official. And Nixon had a visit in the days before his resignation from Republican leaders of the Senate, who basically said that he did not have enough votes to survive that impeachment trial in the Senate. So he was basically advised by his allies that his best course of action was to resign, because by then Republicans in Congress believed that Nixon was going to take them down with him if he stayed in office. So adversarial journalism has persisted, and that has an effect on the media's coverage of politicians and institutions, because politicians are increasingly mistrustful of journalists. And it's important to keep in mind that journalists and politicians need one another, but have very different incentives. And especially investigative journalists, they have the Watergate model, right? For them, the ultimate model of success is getting a scalp, is getting a president's career ended. And so those are the things that they're looking for. And of course, Bill Clinton confronted a lot of that kind of investigative journalism over the course of his administration from 1993 until 2001. And so the idea of attack dog journalism, first and foremost, it creates a reluctance on the part of journalists, getting back to what Kamala Harris was doing in managing her campaign. They don't want to be in unscripted moments with journalists, because they know that journalists have a lot of incentives to try and put them on their back foot and reveal something that might be damaging to them. So the Reagan, Clinton, Bush, and Trump administrations all experienced significant scandals exposed by journalists. Of course, during the Biden administration, journalists have emphasized high inflation and uneven economic recovery in the post-COVID period, as part of their coverage. And they have, focused hostile coverage on his evacuation from Afghanistan. In all of these events, again, to some extent, the media has to say, look, these are newsworthy events. The public has a right to know about these things. But politicians oftentimes will say, you didn't have to frame the events in such a hostile way. That is actually you putting your thumb on the scale and hurting us. And again, it's a perception kind of issue. Journalism in America is highly reliant on what we describe as official sources. And that, again, means people who are in elected office or people who work for elected officials. So leaks typically involve the disclosure of confidential governmental information to the news media. Leaks may come from a variety of sources. Executive branch administration often says, well, it's Congress that's leaky. But in fact, most of the leaking comes from within the executive branch. Okay? One example of a leak that was really consequential was the Pentagon Papers, which I mentioned a little while ago. This was a situation where the Defense Department contracted with a private corporation called the RAND Corporation to conduct a study of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict. And so they wrote up this multi-$1,000 or 1,000-page document that one of the people who was responsible for compiling the document believed that the public should have available to them because it was, they discovered, the RAND Corporation, that the Defense Department was not going to release this to the public. And so this guy basically surreptitiously made a copy, and actually made multiple copies of the Pentagon Papers and leaked them first to, I can't remember if it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, to a journalist by the name of James Risen, who basically they published these things in serialized form because it was, again, thousands of pages, and so they released these in installments within the papers. And the Nixon administration actually attempted to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers on the grounds that it represented a threat to national security. In United States versus New York Times, the Supreme Court held that the public's right to know about the success or relative failure of a war outweighed any considerations of national security. That if we were going to remain a democratic nation, the people had a right to know whether the government thought that the war was going well or poorly. So the leak of the Pentagon Papers, again, contributed greatly to the rise of anti-war sentiment in the United States and fueled protests on American universities, and eventually led to the withdrawal of all American troops from Vietnam. Another good example of a leak was the Trump impeachment 1.0, of course, because there were two impeachments, that originated with a whistleblower who reported on the contents of President Trump's call to the newly elected Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, where he basically said, if you want aid that had already been authorized by Congress, I need you to announce that a criminal investigation has been opened in Ukraine into Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. You don't have to actually conduct a criminal investigation, you just have to announce it. The fact that he said it that way, and that really is kind of the framing of how Trump framed that discussion with the Ukrainian president, really kind of gives a sense that this was a private political act with the intent of smoothing Donald Trump's pathway to winning re-election. This actually happened. These revelations happened months before the COVID outbreak. I mean, if you remember the Trump impeachment trial in the Senate occurred in January of 2020, which again was entering an election year. And so that was highly, highly consequential. And, of course, Trump survived impeachment because not enough Republican senators were prepared to remove him for what was, I believe, an impeachment-worthy, crime. He was abusing his office in the service of, his private ambitions, his ambitions to remain in the presidency. Citizen journalism is something that a lot of journalists are talking about, and they're weighing the pros and cons, and they're very concerned about what citizen journalism can do, both in favor in advancing journalism, but also in damaging journalism to some extent. So there are advantages and disadvantages to the fact that everybody has a cell phone and has the ability to hit record, right? You see these people doing this all the time when, and again, one of the most infamous events during the midst of COVID-19 was a teenager in Minneapolis named Darnella Frazier, who, recorded the police-involved killing of George Floyd, where Floyd had already had COVID, was terrified of being arrested and put in jail where everybody else had COVID, he was resisting arrest, and they grabbed him and put him on the ground, and one officer put his knee on his neck for close to 10 minutes, which effectively smothered him to death. And that was, really a powerful image that could not really be refuted. Ultimately, that police officer and the other 3 police officers that were on the scene were convicted, either of, as being accomplices or were otherwise, viewed as complicit in that crime. So citizen journalism provides immediacy and can provide important context for the news, but it's also important to keep in mind that citizens are not journalists, and that again they can be important filters, they can be important generators of news, but you really need people that are trained to weigh evidence and to determine things like newsworthiness. And so part of the fear that we have, that a lot of media scholars have, is that the more and more we're relying on citizen journalism, we're displacing mainstream journalism. And there's lots and lots of possibility, lots of ground for both disinformation and misinformation. You have also, since the 1990s, seen the rise of opinion-driven journalism. Now, it's important to keep in mind, in most journalistic outfits, there are 2 very important walls of separation. The first wall of separation is typically going to be between the advertising division and the newsroom. There is also another wall of separation between the newsroom and the opinion page. Okay, so you read the news for the news, and the news is driven by journalists who are trained to be objective and independent, and to conduct journalism, hewing to the highest standards of journalism. Opinion guys are there to offer their opinion, and their opinions are oftentimes partisan. And so really we look at the rise of more opinion-driven journalism with the advent of Fox News in the late 1990s. And this again was the argument of Fox initially was, we report, you decide. But their reporting was oftentimes decidedly conservative, and their ideological bent has really not changed, and if anything has gotten more slanted over time. And that has influenced other networks' journalism, especially the cable news networks, MSNBC, and CNN. And they are evolving in terms of, CNN has been fighting over how they should go about covering the news for really several years now, trying to, to say, is there a place in journalism for a cable news network that still holds to the standards of journalism? MSNBC has really become more of a liberal network. And again, to some extent, this reflects programming decisions. In the early days of CNN, remember CNN was created in the early 1980s, they just had news on a loop, and it was basically news programming that was objective, but it just recycled every 3 or 4 hours. That created what a lot of journalists call the news hole, where again there was a programming vacuum that needed to be filled. And so these 24-hour networks began identifying ways of filling the news hole and holding on to viewers for longer and longer periods of time. And so what begins to happen is that now you have morning programs that are opinion-driven, Morning Joe, Fox and Friends. Then you have news programs that are supposed to be more straight journalism, leading into probably around 2 o'clock, where you begin seeing more and more opinion-driven journalism again. And so you see, the evening lineup for Fox News. It's Laura Ingraham, it's Jesse Waters, it's Sean Hannity. And those guys are, frankly, ideologues that are, they have production teams that are producing ideologically slanted news. On MSNBC side, you have the same kind of thing going on, where you have, Ari Melber leading to, I can't remember her name, and then you've got Rachel Maddow, and then you've got, Lawrence O'Donnell and Chris Hayes, and they, again, it reflects a more partisan slant and interpretation of the news, and that is dividing audiences, and this is reflecting this polarization that has occurred, within America. It is a cultural divide where certain people view certain media. They are increasingly occupying different epistemic, environments where what counts as a fact for someone who dwells in Fox world is fundamentally different from someone who dwells in MSNBC land. Okay. So again, that kind of opinionated commentary it's designed to make a profit, right? We're always supposed to, we're supposed to recognize the media is protected by the First Amendment because of those 3 important functions that they perform. But news organizations are privately owned and corporately managed and publicly traded, which means they have a fiduciary obligation to shareholders to make money. And so the decisions of MSNBC and CNN and Fox News reflect the ownership, realities that they've, at the end of the day, their job is to make money. Okay? Journalism of affirmation, again, it goes back again to the 1980s. With what was known prior to from 1940s into the 1980s, about 40 years, the media operated under what was known as the Fairness Doctrine, which was basically a legal obligation on the part of media organizations to basically be balanced. Okay, they couldn't be slanted in one ideological direction or another. The ending of the Fairness Doctrine opened the door first to what we call shock jocks in talk radio, people like Rush Limbaugh. But then it paved the way to the business model that Fox News would employ. The basic argument was there are a lot of conservative viewers out there. Rush Limbaugh has proven that. We can put conservative programming on the air and it will draw audiences that we can sell out, advertising to. So again, Fox News demonstrated the power of ideologically biased programming, and following Fox News, MSNBC and other networks have kind of filled the news hole with lots of more partisan programming. And again, the problem with political news being treated by consumers as entertainment rather than information is a significant issue. Because again, when you're watching the news, you're doing it out of a sense of civic obligation. When you are watching news as an entertainer, you can change the channel whenever you want. You can channel surf. And that leads to two different sets of people. People who are more and more ideologically driven, who view the other side in highly hostile terms, and people who don't watch the news at all, who just channel surf and basically can't be held to pay attention to politics for any length of time. When you look at people now who claim that they're undecided voters, there's probably two things going on. One, some of these folks want to vote for Donald Trump but don't want to tell people that they're voting for Donald Trump. And some of them are people who just haven't taken the time to inform themselves because they're not interested in politics. They're either apolitical or even anti-political. They hate politics and don't really care to get to acquaint themselves with the issues. As I mentioned a minute ago, the media have a powerful profit motive. So who checks or controls the media? The media are not formally part of government. Nobody elects journalists. Most U.S. media are privately owned and corporately managed, and profit is an important, and some would say overriding factor in political coverage. One network news president said, after the 2016 elections, Donald Trump may be bad for the United States, but he's good for, I believe it was CBS News. Because Donald Trump courted controversy, and by courting controversy, he increased audiences. So this raises the issue: should we have a media that is entirely controlled by private actors? In Europe, many countries publicly subsidize their media. And England is a great example. England has the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, which is a government organization. Most English get their news from the BBC. Now that would make you argue, then they are being propagandized, right? Because it's a government corporation. But in fact, it is an independent government organization. It is supposed to be nonpartisan. Now there have been a few instances where there have been moments where the BBC has not necessarily fulfilled its obligation to be fair and neutral in the reporting of the news. But many other countries, they provide airtime to their political parties. Many of these countries have multi-party systems where their job is basically to air programming to basically inform their parties, their voters of what their party is doing to try and improve their lives. And the proof is really in the pudding. Many citizens in European countries actually demonstrate that they're pretty well informed about political events. And in the United States, most surveys kind of reveal, and most scholars of public opinion and political communication will tell you that Americans, a large swath of Americans, are pretty low information in terms of what they know about government and how government works. So European nations provide far more substantial subsidies of these kinds of public broadcasting. It constitutes 2% of the U.S. media network, NPR and the other kinds of public broadcasting comprise 2% of the U.S. market. In Denmark, it's 65% of their market, which is to say, again, this is a government corporation that is operating with tax dollars that is fulfilling the role of informing the public. Most people look at Denmark as a democratic nation, and it is. They get access to good, solid, reliable information that is important to voters and citizens of Denmark. And yet, they don't do things the way we do them. So studies, again, consistently show that European citizens have dramatically higher levels of political knowledge. And again, part of that is we have a large swath of Americans that just don't pay attention. So what are the sources of revenue for the media? This gives rise to, again, when did the media begin to become a profit-taking enterprise? And it goes back to the opening decades of the 19th century, where we get the idea of what became known as the penny press. Prior to that period, newspapers were designed to make money by getting enough money by per unit sales to derive a profit. And that was not a very effective way of driving, of creating a monetized, a monetarily profitable business model for printers. Okay, so ultimately, in the early 19th century, you get the rise of the penny press, and the basic business model of the media from that time forward has been capture the largest audience possible, and then sell them advertising. Okay, so the temptation with that kind of model is to give the public what they want. And so over time, newspapers begin adding more and more what we call soft news features, where you have a food section or a sports section to cater to different groups of Americans. Okay, that focus on soft news over hard news is what really concerns a lot of people. It's we use a kind of a food metaphor. It's people are eating dessert before they're eating their dinner, right? Before they're eating their vegetables. So, does this profit motive contribute to or explain the low levels of political knowledge of many Americans? I think you could probably make that argument. America Side by Side, global freedom of the press. When you look at this map, where is the press most free and independent? Where is it less so? Are there regions of the world that are better at respecting freedom of the press than others? When you look at the 3 and 4, the light green or the dark green, those are basically countries where freedom of the press is respected. What are the measures? Where you see censorship of publications, where you see journalists getting killed or jailed or otherwise prosecuted. Those are important considerations when groups like Freedom House do their studies of media, of press freedom. And again, part of this concern here is that our media, in becoming more and more partisan and being drawn into the culture wars, our media is less free than it was previously. Canada and Europe and even certain Latin American countries have greater levels of freedom of the press than the United States do today. Look at some of these other areas. Obviously, in Russia today, there is zero freedom of the press. Dozens of journalists have been killed. And now the media, if you're saying anything hostile to Vladimir Putin, you're subject to arrest. Any sort of reporting that is critical of the war, of the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine is subject, people are subject to arrest. In India, there is less freedom of the press than there was in the past because the dominant political party in India is hostile to freedom of the press. They don't like bad stories. Many parts of Africa, there is zero, little to no freedom of the press. Only South Africa and one other country really have what we would consider to be freedom of the press. And so, again, why might a government want to impose constraints on media operating within its borders? I'll give you one example. The United States has effectively suppressed a Russian television station, RT,
because we believe they were broadcasting propaganda and spreading misinformation. They were acting as a foreign entity, advancing propaganda within the United States. On the other hand, what do governments gain by allowing or even encouraging a functioning, free press? Well, again, you get those three functions. You get, the public are better informed. The public know where people stand on issues who are campaigning for office, and the public knows about corruption. Again, those are important considerations. Mass media ownerships, scholars, again, going back to the 1980s, have voiced concern over a concentration of media ownership. This actually originates in a scholarship of a journalist who was the dean of a journalism program. I can't remember, at UCal Berkeley or one of those places. A guy named Ben Bagdikian, who wrote a book called The Media Monopoly, that reflected on the idea that more and more media are owned by fewer and fewer corporations. So media monopolies, again, raise the question of whether traditional media produce genuinely diverse political perspectives. More than 3/4 of daily print newspapers are owned by large media conglomerates like Gannett and Knight Ridder. And now there are corporate entities even larger than those. So the media has never been more consolidated. 6 of the media giants, GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS, control 90% of what we read, watch, or listen to. General Electric owns Comcast. They own NBC, Universal Pictures, and Focus Features. News Corp owns Fox. They own Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. Disney owns ABC, ESPN, Pixar, Miramax, Marvel Studios. Viacom owns MTV, Nickelodeon Jr., BET, CMT, and Paramount Pictures. These are, these are important sources of both news and entertainment. And so increasingly, again, these things are being intermingled. So how do media shape news and information? The media can shape and modify public perception of events, issues, institutions, and individuals. The power of images of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s really triggered a great deal of sympathy of Americans, in places other than the United States. So in the 1940s, if you were a white person living in New York City and you read in the New York Times a civil rights protest had been dispersed by police, that's simply an anodyne description. But when you see the brutality that Southern police were using in suppressing civil rights, protesters, you get a far greater sense of, when you see the visuals, when you see on the evening television those kinds of images, that really had a powerful effect. Now, I am generally critical of the influence of television on Americans. I think that the coverage generally is superficial. But the power of images, like I mentioned, the power of that police officer smothering George Floyd during, in the midst of COVID, those are images that that are burned, that have a powerful effect. People often say a picture is worth, 1,000 words. Well, a visual can be, is exponentially more meaningful very frequently. So again, likewise, the media played a powerful role in the Nixon administration's negotiations to end the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, in Nixon's Americanization policies. Again, because the public was turned solidly against the war, because again, it was a long-standing war and we were not winning per se. And that also had a powerful effect on how the military allows journalists to cover wartime situations in the current setting. So, what are some things that the media can do that influence how the news is covered? First is agenda setting. right? The media plays a dominant role in establishing newsworthiness, right? And that is this idea that this is something that the public needs to know. And again, we don't elect journalists to make these kinds of decisions. Nevertheless, they are oftentimes, they're the ones that are gatekeepers in terms of what kinds of information gets reported on a day-to-day basis. So the media's ranking of establishing where a story should be. In the newspaper business, it was, if it was the front page above the fold story, that was the story of the day. It was, without any question, the most important thing that people needed to know at any particular point in time. And the same thing happens with network news today. They decide what stories they're going to lead. What is the first story that they're going to run with? What is the last story that they're going to run with? How you order these stories has an influence over how the people, how the public perceives them. The media oftentimes implicitly diminish the relevance of issues like climate change or homelessness because they don't really focus on them that much, except in various points in time. Like right now, the idea of climate change is coming back because we're having back-to-back horrific hurricanes hitting, Florida and the southern Atlantic coastline. And that is, but the reason, the fact that that coverage is episodic, that there's not this dominant theme that the public is being exposed to. They're not continually being educated on the relevance of the news, is important. The media also play, they have different ways of covering things. We'll talk about this in other areas as well. When they're on patrol mode, they are simply gathering the news. When I teach my foreign policy class, I talk about the golden triangle, the executive branch, the State Department, and the Defense Department. As being the White House, State Department, and Defense Department is sort of where journalists go to get news. They attend those press conferences. They do it on a daily basis, and that is the daily kind of generator of news. And that is basically the journalists getting the news from those official sources. The alarm mode is when something bad happens, and then they're in escalated coverage mode. Then you see the chyrons on TVs flowing across the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen. The media also has a powerful ability to frame events. The media often present information from a certain perspective to shape the audience understanding of that information. So the media's inclusion or exclusion of information is oftentimes a marketing decision, and again, oftentimes reflects what they think is going to grab an audience or repel an audience. So again, when you look at MSNBC versus Fox News's coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you're really seeing a study of contrasts. Because again, Fox News has largely been devoted to framing foreign policy in terms of minimizing the threat posed by Russia to U.S. national security. Whereas MSNBC, really since 2016, has emphasized Russia as a malign actor that is determined to manipulate our politics, and whose invasion of Ukraine, represents a threat to national security. Likewise, I think CBS recently had an interview in the morning with 3 journalists and an author by the name of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a book, recently has written a book. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but one of the stories in the book, it's organized around 3, kind of long stories. One of which was him attending a city hall or a school board meeting where they were talking about banning one of his books. But another, he spent, one of the longer stories was about his visit to Israel and the West Bank. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a Black American, and he he believes in social justice, and he thinks that Israel is an ethnocracy, is a Jewish state where people who are not Jewish are treated differently. And he wanted to write a story about the social justice implications of that. And so the CBS interview very quickly turned into a very hostile, very controversial interview where one of the journalists who is Jewish was basically accusing him of anti-Israeli and basically accusing him of being anti-Semitic. And Coates's response, first and foremost, was, what you're criticizing me for has plenty of people representing them in U.S. media. The U.S. media is overwhelmingly pro-Israeli. Most Americans are pro-Israeli. As a journalist, he was simply pointing to the injustice of what he views as apartheid in Israel. And his basic point was, look, this is black or white to me from my perspective. Either apartheid is wrong or it is acceptable. That's the argument that I was making in the book. It was an interesting exchange, but it again reflects this power of framing, where, and again, there's been follow-up within CBS News, where some people within the news division believed that interview, went off the rails, and that the journalist Tony Dokoupil was very, basically was no longer acting like an impartial journalist and was acting like an advocate for the state of Israel. And so, that led to introspection within CBS because they want to maintain their independence and their objectivity. And there was pushback on the pushback within CBS, as you'll often see as newsrooms kind of wrestle with these kinds of issues, because it is a highly contentious issue as to, how Israel is conducting the war in Gaza and the West Bank and now in Lebanon. And they've also launched attacks on Yemen as well. And so, from my perspective, I think the argument needs to be, we need to see these arguments. We need to see both, arguments for why Israel has a right of self-defense, which I absolutely believe they do, but also that how they go about conducting their self-defense reflects on the United States, as we are their largest and most powerful ally, and they're our most staunch ally in the Middle East. The media will also prime people. Again, they by calling attention to certain issues when reporting on political events and stories, that again will reflect something that one journalist said: the media can't tell you what to think, but they can influence what you think about. Okay? So priming can act like a kind of political filter that provides the public with interpretive cues. And again, the media's coverage of the 2020 presidential election primed the public to view the election through the lens of COVID-19, right? Because the public, the media kind of tended to view, what was going on as a referendum on how COVID-19 had been handled. All right, so now let's move on to our second topic. There are many sources of political news, okay? It's important to keep in mind in the opening days when we first had established media, the dominant mode was newspapers. What displaced newspapers? Well, first, it was radio, right? In the part of after around 1920, by the Great Depression, most Americans had radios, and people gathered around the radio to listen to programming in the evenings. And then television came along and displaced radio as the dominant form of, dominant medium of communication. And now we're dealing with social media, which is sort of a hybrid that reflects a lot of different kind of, fusions of media. Every time technology displaces a certain kind of media, it's not like that media goes away. Newspapers have found a way to survive with a smaller share of the audience. Likewise radio, likewise television. But every change also has changes to how we view what's going on in the world and how we interpret politics. So who creates the news? Who creates the news and how the news is delivered is very consequential. While information is literally at Americans' fingertips, again, who is responsible for producing it? Do you want, again, unelected journalists and editors and people in mainstream news organizations? Many Americans say they don't want that kind of news anymore because they believe it is ideologically slanted. Nevertheless, oftentimes those same people that say they don't like the mainstream, the lamestream media, are going to partisan outfits that are effectively propagandizing them. Okay? And so that, that produces a kind of paradox, right? Do these news originators fill the three basic roles of the media in American democracy? Or are they doing something fundamentally different that is much more problematical in terms of how we're informing ourselves? It creates you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. If you leave Americans to their own devices and allow media organizations that really aren't news organizations to act as news organizations, what damage are we doing to democracy? So what are the mainstream news organizations? The mainstream news organizations, again, they adhere to journalistic principles and conduct original factual reporting. And included in these principles are verifying their sources as credible, engaging in fact-checking and corrections, right? If they make a mistake in a printed article, they will later say, there was an error. We regret this error. Here is the correction. They will not rely on paid sources. They will engage in investigative reporting. Mainstream news organizations also vet content prior to publication, allow subjects of stories an opportunity for comment, and that by doing so comply with libel and defamation laws. Journalistic mores of the mainstream news emphasized balanced coverage and avoid including personal opinions in their reportage. And when they don't, when they aren't doing those things, when they're engaging in analysis or opinion, they designate those articles that way. Okay? Partisan disagreement over which sources of news are mainstream is considerable. Okay? 2/3 of Americans, nevertheless, continue to say they get their news from mainstream news sources. But keep in mind, 1/3 of Americans are effectively getting their news from basically partisan sources. Okay? So when you look at, what are the mainstream news media? Republicans and Democrats largely agree. ABC is a mainstream news. CNN, the New York Times, MSNBC, Fox News, even 72% of Democrats accept Fox News as part of the mainstream media. The Wall Street Journal is widely viewed as a credible mainstream news organization. It gets lower the further down you go that particular chart. But again, part of the problem, it's not everybody, but it's enough that it is destabilizing our politics, because again, there are people that just reject things that are central to many mainstream people who are mainstream consumers of news that view as essential aspects of American political life. So I'm going to close on that note. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of the media and the role of political information in American politics. I'll see you next time.